Common Cause New York's Democracy in Action Award. Lance, well deserved.
When one receives an award like this, there's a lot of gratitude, but also reluctance and uneasiness, because many of you who are here, many of the organizations that are represented here, are the people that I worked with who really made this possible. Also, to be fortunate to work with foundations like the Nathan Cummings Foundation, where the board and the Cummings family really enabled and were brave enough to do these kinds of activities, really is the greatest gift someone could be given. And there are so many organizations here that have been involved in these efforts that have really made the change. It's just a few of us that may have got it kick-started, but the yeoman's work is done by these groups. I also want to thank Marjorie, and I want to thank Common Cause because we were able to share a train ticket to get here. I don't know if I should say that in front of Ernest of the MTA, but in making this truly a family affair and to celebrate our common cause of 41 years. So thank you, Marge. Why shareholder activism through proxy voting? Corporations have been able to externalize risks and costs on others for their own private gain. Environmental degradation, undermining of regulations, undermining of safety, securing tax policies that really benefit them and undermine the public fisc. And all of these things done on a large scale to the point where it really undermines our democracy and starts to establish a plutocracy. We used to have countervailing power that stopped this externalization of risks and costs. Unions, public policy, and other groups. But they have been buried under the resources, especially the resources that have now been unleashed with the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court. And this is what we have to address. But we have a secret. And this was the one insight that I think many of us got in the early years. It's not their money. We own these corporations in our endowments, in our pension funds. And we have to exercise that ownership, and that's the key to the whole thing. Now, shareholder activism is imperfect. It's the first stages on a long journey, primarily to internalize these risks and costs that corporations put off on us, thus setting the right incentives to actually deal with environmental problems and these safety problems and so on. Many examples of proxy voting and resolutions that have been brought over the years in the environment, we have dealt with very specific issues of greenhouse gases, pollution, cancer-causing drugs, all kinds of things. And in many individual cases, we really helped the situation by bringing proxy resolutions. Many of these could be brought because they're win-win situations. That once when you stepped into that boardroom, once when the corporate managements were actually listening, the result was, actually, it's more efficient not to pollute. It costs less not to pollute. So there are lots of win-win propositions. But there are also a number of cases that aren't. And that's what we have to concentrate on. And also the transaction costs of doing this are so very high. We've also worked on a number of issues such as governance reform in corporations. One of the big revolutions that's occurred, and that's through foundations and a lot of the groups here and public pension funds and Harvard Law School, is that we brought a series of resolutions that really changed the voting of boards of directors so they weren't staggered. They were all voted at the same time, which has created tremendous accountability within the system. But these are all tough issues, and we're dealing with them sort of one at a time, but we have more systematic issues that we have to deal with. And we're trying to deal with these with shareholder rights actions. As we all know, the U.S. is becoming more unequal and plutocratic. We have growing wealth inequality, and it's staggering. As the Economic Policy Institute tells us, in 2010, the top 1% of households held 1.5 times more wealth than the bottom 90%. From 1983 to 2010, 38.3% of all wealth went to the top 1%. 74.2% went to the top 5%. The bottom 60% actually lost wealth. Professor Satz says that the first 2 years of the recovery from the recession, 2009 and 2010, the top 1% captured 93% of the income growth. What's the result of all this? Truncated lives, defeated possibilities, undermining of opportunities. In comparison with 20 advanced industrialized countries, median income for 12 of these is at least 60% higher than in the United States. And the U.S. has more wealth inequality than 16 of its peers. The bottom line, cross-country studies almost all show the U.S. has lower, not higher, social mobility than other wealthy countries. The American dream is fast becoming a myth. Now, CEO compensation and executive compensation adds to this problem. It's really interesting because CEOs and executives in the Fortune 500, the S&P 500 companies account for a large percent of the top 0.1% of the wealthy in this country. The ratio of CEO pay has been going up astronomically as compared to the average worker. In 2011, it was 380 times what the average worker earned. That's up from 2010, where it was 343 times. But if you look back to 1980, it was only 42 times. So we see the wealth is increasing within that small group. And what's really frustrating in all of this, as Lucian Bebchuk at Harvard Law School has written in his book, Compensation Without Performance, is that this CEO and executive compensation isn't linked to performance. There's no correlation, not negative, not positive, none. It's arbitrary. And that was really brought home when in 2011, the S&P 500 index was flat, and average compensation for CEOs was up 13.9%. All of this inequality really translates into a platonic power, with money subverting our democratic processes, both by the individual rich and by the Supreme Court really unleashing corporate wealth into the political process. And much of this unleashed corporate wealth is really secret and therefore unaccountable. As Demos reports, the top 32 super PAC donors, 32 individuals, matched all the money raised by Obama and Romney from all small donors under $200, 3.7 million people. Nearly 60% of super PAC funding comes from just 159 people. More than 93% of all the money super PACs raise came from 3,318 donors, or a little more than 1/1,000th of the population. And for-profit corporations, they were the second largest donors to super PACs, accounting for 12% of all the donations. Business provided a significant position of its funds for the most active super PACs, like Freedom Works for America. Business gave them 52.7% of their money. Study after study has shown that money makes a big difference, but not only in federal and congressional elections, but in local elections, state elections, and really importantly, judicial elections. And much of this money is unaccountable. Of the FEC reported spending, 31% came from sources that couldn't be traced. 58% of the funds spent by outside groups for the presidential TV commercials was dark money. We don't know where it came from. Now, there has been a great shareholder response, and Comptroller DiNapoli gave the Qualcomm example, which I wanted to give because it is a model, but also a number of actions taken for the Center for Political Accountability, Public Citizen, and other groups that have really tried to make this money visible, which is very important, because once made visible, you're accountable. And we've seen when that money became visible, like Target in Minnesota, when they gave to an anti-gay candidate, they were held accountable. And we can see this if we just can put sunlight on this money. But also, when we look at resolutions that deal with corporate compensation issues. I can remember when we were laughed out of shareholder meetings when we brought these resolutions. And what happened? By bringing those resolutions, we actually won some. Think of Chesapeake. Think of a few of our banks. And now it's actually in the law of the banking reform where shareholders have to pass on compensation issues. All of this is a start, and it's a great start, and it ought to be followed up. But I want to say one thing about what the next stage has to be. The next stage has to be we have to deal with Citizens United. And the only way we can deal with that, really, is by a constitutional amendment. We have to turn this back, and we have to take back our democracy and enforce it within the Constitution. We cannot let a Supreme Court bare majority base a jurisprudence on dicta and a footnote in a 19th century Supreme Court case determine how our democracy is going to operate. We have to ask the question about, is a corporation really a person with all the privileges, immunities, and rights of a person? Now, quite frankly, I really support the position of the individual that said, I will believe a corporation is a person when Texas executes one. But I think when we look at this, when we see perpetual life of corporations, that they can operate in multiple jurisdictions, they have limited liability, that corporations and you and me are not the same thing. So this is something that is really in the future, and Public Citizen, Free Speech for People, Common Cause, and a number of other groups are really working on this. And that, I think, is going to be how we can begin to consolidate some of these gains that we've made by still following through on shareholder actions. The last thing I want to say to you is I was fortunate enough in my career to work for many years in the human rights movement and to work with people who labored in very dangerous situations for human rights. And especially in Central American wars in the 80s, I remember talking to somebody when we were dealing with issues with death squads. And I said, why do you do this? This is really dangerous. I mean, people were getting killed. We would have to go to the garbage dumps to identify bodies. And they said, because it's right. No big philosophical explanation, because it's right. And I said, well, that's interesting, but you're running very high risk for yourself and your family, and the success is really quite problematic. How come you still do this? And they looked at me, as sometimes they did after 2 beers, and said, Lance, you're such an American. You really don't understand. It's the ability to struggle and fight for the right thing that counts. That is the greatest privilege and the greatest gift. And many of the people in this room, Foundation colleagues, organizations that we've worked with over the years, have given me that greatest privilege and gift to be able to fight back. And for that, I will always be thankful. Thank you.